Delay, we'll get started. Oh, yes, perfect. We will get started with a little bit of an introduction here, and I'm going to share my screen so that we can walk through this together. Okay. So, the first thing I'd like to do is just really emphasize that I want to hear from you. Sharon and I want to hear authentic reaction to what we're sharing today. You're welcome to put that in the chat box or to chime in with your mic. Absolutely, that would be fine to do. We also would like to be able to provide an anonymous option for you. Sharon has put a link in the chat for you. You can also use the QR code if you would like, or just go to slido.com and enter the number. The only advantage of this is it's anonymous. So if you want to give a scathing report, Slido may be your preferred route to doing so. My main emphasis is I just want to make sure we're hearing honest feedback from you today. And if Slido helps with that, then all the better. And I should just emphasize, feel free to interrupt at any time. Don't save your questions till the end. We'd like to be able to address any concerns you have as we go along today in the agenda. We'll do a brief introduction of where this transition readiness toolkit came from today, and then I'll talk about what exactly the transition readiness toolkit is, and then we'll actually spend some time with implementation and practicing. The end of our conversation today will be all about how to administer the TRT effectively to make sure it can work in many different use cases in Michigan. Okay, so I'm actually going to piggyback on to the things that Jennifer was talking about. When I came to Utah about 5 years ago, I reached out to Utah's VR agency, and I simply asked them if there's anything that I could help them with that had been kind of a sticky problem for them. And they told the story in very much the same way Jennifer told it. USOR, Utah VR, talked about how they were doing pre-ETs. Now, they had actually had some directive from their state leadership that they needed to try to measure change over time. And so, frankly, that's a lot of where this idea came from. And so when I reached out, they said, we've been trying to measure change or improvement resulting from pre-ETs, and it's been challenging. It's been really difficult for us. And so I began working with them in hopes that we could figure out some solutions. And the only way we were able to do that was to spend a lot of time listening to providers like you, asking about their use cases, asking what it is they do for each service, and making sure we embedded all of that insight and understanding into the tools. Now, initially, the contractors were asked to develop their own tools by Utah. We eventually moved to a place where we had one set of tools that could be used across the state, allowing for state leadership and providers to have understanding that was constant with the assessment tools being unchanged. All right, so it's important for me just to explain what we mean when we say the Transition Readiness Toolkit. It is a collection of 10 assessment tools that map very closely with the 5 core pre-ET services. I'll explain more in pretty soon order why there's 10 assessment tools to go with the 5 core pre-ETs. We also refer to it as an online software program, and it's really crucial that we've made it so it offers real-time data so that people who are using this day in and day out can immediately get access to some of the insights that the toolkit provides. And then we strive to make sure it's a simple and accessible mechanism designed for seamless improvement. One of the owners of the Transition Readiness Toolkit, his day job is actually in software accessibility. And so we're always striving to make sure that the software, the platform that you're using is accessible to all and simple to use. Now, you are not the first state to be using the Transition Readiness Toolkit, and that's a good thing. We worked out a lot of the bugs over time, over the last 3 years with many other states. We feel like we're in a pretty good place. We're still always seeking to improve. But we started with Utah, as I mentioned, back in 2020, early 2021. We've also been working with Montana, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Rhode Island. Now, coming on board, I think all 3 of these are in October, are Wyoming, Michigan, of course, and North Carolina. And so we're really excited to see this expanding across states, and we're in conversations with new states almost every week. To date, we have data from nearly 21,000 student assessments. And I'll talk to you more about what these assessments look like and the kind of insights and information it can provide. But this is an exciting new element to have this much rich data on whether the students changed resulting from services is a big deal for State VR, and it's proven really helpful for the states who are using it. And I want to speak to that for just a moment. The benefits are numerous. One of the things that we've really appreciated is just the ability to see how much success is resulting from pre-ET services. We've heard from many providers who weren't initially sure about the TRT. However, when they started using it, they came to be some of the biggest champions. One of the reasons for that is many people who are in pre-ETs were at one time doing adult services. In adult services, there's a conclusion to all of your work in the form of employment, and that's something we celebrate. It's something we identify as a measure of success. In the pre-ETs world, there's been fewer measures of success. There are some out there, but being able to measure change allows us to celebrate those successes more frequently across many more students, and that's a real powerful opportunity. It also offers data-driven guidance. So there may be opportunities where we do this kind of data measurement and we see opportunities to improve or things we might want to tweak and see if it improves some of the outcomes for our students. Allowing for that data-driven guidance is really powerful. It also supports working with schools. We've appreciated this opportunity and really leaned into it. It wasn't one of the first things we started out with thinking about. However, in the states that are using this, we're seeing a lot more connection with schools in relation to their IEP goals. We've seen it used to form and shape measurable skills gains that are necessary for them to show. And importantly, it helps schools to better appreciate the good that pre-ETS does and the change it creates. Finally, it empowers agencies in curriculum development. These tools are very notably not a new curriculum. We actually believe that the best curriculums right now are with people like you who day in and day out are doing their best to offer pre-ET services. However, combining data with your current curriculums gives you more freedom and more information on how you can improve those curriculums or change them up to make them even more useful for the students you're serving. So we're seeing a lot of benefit, and it's been really exciting for us. All right, I'm going to start a little bit of a conversation about that. What is in the TRT? But before I do we have any questions or comments? I'm just checking my Slido as well. Nothing so far. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. Now, here is where I get to explain why there are 10 assessment tools mapped onto 5 core pre-ET services. So I know you're highly familiar with the core pre-ETs, and those are captured in many of our assessments. So we have an assessment for job exploration. We have one for work-based learning. We have one for self-advocacy and counseling on post-secondary enrollment. However, when we got to workplace readiness training and we listened to the providers that were doing pre-ET services, one thing that we heard across almost all the providers was that they were doing a variety of different services that weren't actually that related with each other. That meant that we couldn't use one assessment tool to capture workplace readiness as a whole category very well. Instead, what we needed to do was to break down the most common areas of training and make sure we had assessment tools for each one of them. So that's the list on the right. Under workplace readiness training, we have communication and social skills training, workplace soft skills training, financial literacy training, independent living orientation and mobility training, and then job seeking training. Now, if you're really detail oriented, you're saying that's 9 assessment tools. The last one that I should explain is that the work-based learning has a change measure that is a baseline and a post assessment, but it also has a post-only assessment. That post-only assessment allows us to evaluate the quality of the site that the student worked in. It asks questions about whether they were paid, whether they completed their time there, whether they'd recommend that site to another student. And I'll show you these more in just a moment. And I'll just ask again, any questions about these 10 assessments? We are going to go in, when we look at the software together, we'll be able to show you exactly what this looks like and some more description on these tools. One thing that really was essential out of our conversations with providers and with parents for that matter, I should tell you that the development of the TRT in total took about 3 years. It involves 6 different states. And when we were in those states, we actually had a grant, a federal grant that allowed us to pay parents and students with disabilities receiving pre-ETs. It allowed us to talk with leadership in agencies and state leadership and really just get their feedback on the tools. And so when I talk about feedback, it came from 6 different states and a multitude of listening conversations where we learned what were the needs. And what came out of that was a few critical areas. One, all items were written at or below a 4th grade reading level. We know immediately that some of your students still won't be able to do the assessments alone with a 4th grade reading level, but it does give access to a lot of the students you serve. That's what we've experienced across other states anyway. We offer an online and a paper pencil version of the assessment tools. And before the end of this year, there'll be an app that allows you to have even more flexibility in how you administer. We also provide extensive instruction on how to administer, and I'll do that at the end of the presentation today, but we'll talk about when students should do it independently, when they might need support, and when they should have a trusted observer complete it on their behalf. Last, but maybe most important, we know that you're extremely busy. You are not ever sitting around in your agencies wondering what you should do next. And so it was important for us to make sure that the assessments were brief while still being rigorous and still giving us good data. And what we found is we've been able to do that with assessments that take an average of 2 to 3 minutes across each one of them. And so these should be things, and our intent was that these are things you can fit within your services without being disruptive to those services or without throwing you off in your very busy days. All right, now I'm about to show you a demonstration of the toolkit, and I'm actually going to allow those who are able to demo it themselves and give a little bit of a tour of what is available and the features it has. But I wanted to point out, first of all, we're going to use a demo login today. Sharon is going to be working with you very closely to get you access to your own login and profile information so that before October 1st, you'll be able to create your own. Students are never given access to your logins, and they're never asked to create their own username and password. We have other mechanisms for the students to be able to access the assessment tools without ever having to have a username or password. And that's a really good thing. I've got kids at home, and I know that with or without disability, remembering username and passwords at that age and stage of life can be really tricky. So we'll lean on your own login and profile information. Before October 1st, you'll have access to that. One thing I want to note, but we'll put this in the chat for you, when we get into the demo site, your access to the demo version is available through this username, demo-agency2, and the password is demo-agency2 again with 2 exclamation points. As I noted, Sharon will put that in the chat in just a moment before we start this demonstration. The last thing I want to point out, I've mentioned that you have a username and password. Today you'll be using the demo version, but before October 1st, you'll be using your own username and password. And then when you get into the assessment tools, you'll be asked to enter the student's participant ID number. In your case, in the state of Michigan, you'll be entering the customer ID. And so you'll log in with the demo agency's login and password. And October 1st, you'll be logging in with your own specific username and password. But then when you go to enter the assessment tools, you will enter the customer ID in order to access the assessments. And I'll spend just a moment on that. One of the powerful elements of that is that that's a non-identifying number for the student and allows us to be able to still map it to your case management data. If you would ever like in the future, you could merge our data set with your broader data set to have even more rich information related to change. Okay, so with that said, I think we're ready to take it for a spin. Sharon has put both the URL to access the site and the username and password into the chat box. And I'm going to follow that lead and go into the site with you. I'm going to give you a brief tour before we give you some time yourselves to navigate around as well. The first thing you'll notice is you're getting to this landing page. And I'll just make sure I pause here and make sure no one gets left behind. Hopefully you're all able to access this page. Let us know in the chat or chime in if you're not able to get access to it. Now, if I type log in, that's my opportunity to go ahead and enter that username and password. So I'm going to make it so you can see the password here. And we would not only allow you to use this demo agency outside of this meeting today, but we would encourage it. We would really appreciate it if you could even share this with others in your workplace who are about to use the toolkit or who are interested in it. The demo agency provides a really nice opportunity for you to get around the site without messing up any of your own data. And so we encourage it. Okay, so now what you should be able to experience and see is the landing page or the home page of the Transition Readiness Toolkit. And for those of you out there, I just want to make sure that the demo login information worked for you before I move on. If anyone's having any difficulty, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll problem solve with you. We had one case yesterday where someone had a difficult time getting in and we figured it out. Okay, I'm going to hope that silence is golden and you're all in. I'm going to start to get through the tour. No problem, Beth. That's great. Just observing is no problem at all as well. So here what you have are the assessment tools in a list on the right-hand side of the screen. And so these are the exact ones I just described earlier. Notice we have work-based learning and a separate work-based learning post only, just as described. We also have those workplace readiness assessments that are broken down by the different ways that you could create change. Now, I'm going to start off by describing the 3 ways that students can gain access to the assessments, since again, they're not going to have their own username and password. They're not going to have their own login information. Now, the 3 ways are built to handle different situations. My understanding is that most of your pre-ETS work is going to happen in groups. And so we're going to put more time and energy into explaining that approach. But I want to make sure you understand all 3 ways, just in case one of them comes up for you. So the first use case might be that I'm sitting down with a student and they're in my office, or I have a laptop in their space. I'm logged in and I just have one student in the room. In that case, one thing I might do is just click on an assessment tool. Now, here's where I need to make sure I'm actually going to enter the same number consistently. Because I want to be able to show you what the data looks like after they enter it. So I'm going to say that the student's case ID to match with Michigan is 81122. And I just need to re-enter that number twice. Now, let me clarify. When you go to do your own demo, if you're in the site yourself, you can enter any fake number you want for the sake of a demo. Just make sure you enter the same number both times. So as I enter that number, the self-advocacy assessment, I'm then permitted to go ahead and complete the assessment tool. Again, please notice these are all written in very simple language. That's on purpose to give access to as many students as possible to self-reporting. We even provide some very simple instructions meant to help you as a provider. These instructions read, you are being asked a few questions to learn more about how we can give you better services. One of the main things we want to emphasize here to the students is this is not a test. There's no wrong answers, and we put those in the instructions. We also, you noticed before, our motive is to provide them better services and to know how to do that. And so if you share those concepts with students, we hope that it will help them to not be anxious, but also to be very honest in their reporting as best as they can. Now, I'm going to go through this rather quickly because I'm going to give you some time during this presentation to go look at the data and go look at these assessments more extensively yourselves. So I'm just going to fill this out. If I miss an item, then it's going to ask me to fill it out before I continue on. You can see that's a very brief assessment, and yet it's proven to be very helpful to administrators and providers in other states. So then the last part asks, whether it was completed without help, whether it was completed with help, or whether someone did it for them. One thing I want to clarify here, at the end of this presentation, we'll talk a lot about administration. If you're simply reading the questions out loud for the students, we don't constitute that as being help. However, if you need to explain items to students and help them understand what the options are, then that would be where it would tip over into doing it without, or doing it with help, as I just clicked there. Okay, so I completed the assessment, and that's a simple way you can do it if you have a student with you in your office. Now, this box here that I'm hovering over that says Manage Student Access, this offers the other two ways you can do an assessment. Generating a code is ideally matched to doing this in a group format. Generating a link allows you to send out a link to a student by text or email that is very specific to that student and that student alone. Now, what I like to do when I'm offering the training is to show you what this looks like by using these option menus on the left-hand side. As a general rule, clicking on the left-hand side will give you more explanation or description of what each one is. And let me just highlight that. If I click on assessments, it's going to show me the exact same assessments you saw on the right-hand side with your list, but now it's going to be accompanied by an explanation of what's included in each service. Again, that left-hand menu just gives you a little bit more of a prompt to what's going on with each of the features and options. So here, if I go to click on Student Access, this is where I can get more understanding of what these two options look like. Again, creating a new code is best for group format. And the way that works, you can see I did this yesterday with a group, but we'll go ahead and create a new one. And so if I create a new code, it's going to ask me for a session name. And so I'm sure there is a Grand Rapids High School somewhere in Grand Rapids. And I'm going to say that on that day, I'm going to go do group training to that school. I'm going to be focusing on self-advocacy training. So then notice that each of these links are specific to a single assessment. So I click the assessment that I'm going to be doing this with. And then I finally have one more option, which is how long will this link last? So if I'm in the classroom that day, I'm at Grand Rapids High School, 2 hours may be more than enough. If I'm setting this up the day before or 2 days before, I'll choose those options to make sure the link is still active when I get to the school to do this. Now, when I click on this and I save this session, you'll notice that Grand Rapids High School now has an assessment that's set up along with an access code and a reminder of when my assessment is going to expire. So now I can just follow the instructions for how this would be administered in a classroom, and I'll walk that through with you right now. So to administer the assessment, we would direct students to go to gotrt.app. If I'm in the classroom, you can just picture, I'd probably be writing this one up on the whiteboard, gotrt.app, or if I have some way to do it, I could just email all of them with this link. Now, I will go ahead and carry this out myself by clicking on this, and this is the screen that the students would see when they go to gotrt.app. Frankly, the only thing they'll be able to do is enter that code. Now, if I go back to this site, what I'm also going to need is the access code. So I would also write this down on the whiteboard for students or share it out with them digitally if that's an option. YR203. Now I'm able to cheat and just copy and paste that. But if you were with students, again, they may not have the ability to have it sent to them digitally, so you could just write it on the whiteboard. And then you are off to the races. What would happen next in that group format is all of your students would be sent to the screen where they need to enter their case ID. You know and I know that they aren't going to know their case ID number. And so this is where, and I just would note, group work is very efficient, but sometimes we have to do a little bit more planning to make it go smoothly. So our strong recommendation to you here is that if you know you're going into a classroom and you know the students that you're going to be working with, what we'd recommend is having a 3x5 card or a laminated piece of paper with the student's name on it and their case ID number on it that you could just have laid down on their desk at the beginning of that day. That way, when they get to this screen, it literally will take 30 seconds at the most for all of your students to enter their participant ID twice. and get access to the assessment tool. So let's pretend I'm a student. I'm looking at that number on my desk, and I am very purposely entering the same number as I did last time. That will allow me to show you what it looks like to have a pre and a post assessment. Now I'm going to show you what it tends to look like, and that's usually quite a bit of improvement here. So I'm just going to capture that improvement as I go through. And I'm going to miss an item on purpose here just to show you that when I miss an item, it tells the students they've missed a question. You have to answer them all before moving on. Okay, and so I go back and I answer that question and I can move forward. And then I'll hit submit. The last option I'm not going to spend as much time on, but before I get to that one, I know a lot of you doing group administration, so I want to pause here and ask if you have any concerns or questions related to how to do a group administration. And I'll check my slide on my phone.
Hey, Brian, this is Rick Diamond. This, just to check, this is assuming that each student has access to a laptop, correct?
A laptop, a phone works fine.
Or a phone or a tablet or whatever.
Any kind of a screen will do. So yeah, there is an assumption here that you find that option. Now, for some schools, we're finding that they have like a Chromebook or something they can access that day. Others are going to a computer lab. But many are using student phones if that's something the school permits. Yeah, I appreciate that clarification, Rick.
And okay, and a sort of a follow-up at the very beginning, you also mentioned a pencil paper option. Can you at some point, if you're not going to, also address what that would look like and how the data would be entered?
Yes,
Thanks.
absolutely. That'll be the fourth thing I'll show you. So don't let me forget, Rick. That's really important. I appreciate you chiming in. Now, the last option, and I'm just going to do it through here again, is to generate a student link. Now, in this case, you just would be able to access it on that home page or by going to student access. And this one would work quite differently. You'll notice the pop-up here asks, first of all, for that participant ID. In Michigan's case, it asks for the case ID that's associated with this student. So again, I'm going to stay consistent and make this the same fake student throughout. And this time I'm going to we'll do job seeking under workplace readiness training. And then what you'll find, a lot of people are demoing this right now, mostly from Michigan. But if I scroll down, I can see the student's ID right here. I see the job seeking option, and then I see a unique URL. Now, if I send this to the student via text or email or any other way you could send a link, one thing you're going to notice about this is sending it to the student means they don't have to enter the case ID number again. And so this can be really useful if a student isn't in your office and you want to get the link to them. You could always attempt to do this before they start services. You could send it out a day in advance and say, hey, please complete this baseline assessment before we meet. They may or may not respond to that, though. The only challenge or limitation to the generating link option is students are pretty good at ignoring surveys, just like I am. And so sometimes it requires them to be with you in person before they'll prioritize it and complete it. I'm just going to, for the sake of looking at the data later, fill out this assessment. And let's see here, almost done. Oops, I missed one. I didn't mean to that time. That was not for the demo. Okay, and so I've completed that assessment. Now, before I even show you the data, I actually want to lean into Rick's question because it's a really good one. You'll notice there is an option down in the lower part of the homepage for downloadable assessments. Now, if I go to this page, what I'm going to see is each one of the assessments broken down as a self-report option. This is exactly how they see it online, or a guided option. So if you're helping a student and you know you're going to need to guide them through the assessment tool, this just rewords the questions in third person. So to ask as if you were talking to a student, asking them the questions. And so you can see those available for each one of these. You also have the option to download them as a zip file. And as Jennifer reminded me to point out yesterday, and I appreciated this, you also do have an option to download the assessments with smiley faces. So a lower score is reflected in a frowny face and a higher score is reflected in a smiley face. We used to have that embedded in all of the online assessments, but a lot of students actually felt like that was paternalistic. Other students who needed some assistance often just got pulled into the smiley faces and chose them because they thought they were just a happier option. So we give you the option now, but we don't require it. The last thing I want to point out here is that in a couple of weeks, within a couple of weeks, you're also going to have a zip file or an option. And actually, I'll be happy for Sharon to chime in with how this might look. But for multiple other, what I refer to as marginalized languages. So when I say marginalized languages, we didn't choose the most common languages in the United States. Sometimes they are common, but we really tried to emphasize is languages where English isn't likely to be spoken in the home. So that included Spanish. It also included many refugee population languages. So Jennifer asked if we have Arabic. We do have a translation for Arabic. We have a translation for Chinese, traditional and simple. We have a translation for French for people coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and multiple other languages. But if you're working with a client that you could use a language for, you can always reach out to us. Sharon, would you add anything about where that'll be or what it'll look like?
That will be on this same page. It'll just be down below the zip file assessment tools. So this page will actually be getting a makeover, possibly before you even get your logins, but it will all be in the same location here.
Thank you, Sharon. Now, one thing I'll just point out while I'm here, there is a little bit of a link on how to make determinations of whether students should self-report. We're not going to go on to that right now because I'm saving that for the end of the presentation. But just know you can always come back and reference that information here or at the Help Center or within the training videos, by the way. Okay. Rick, does that answer your question for these?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
The one last thing I'll note here, the downloadable assessments can be useful primarily for one reason, and that is that if you go into a school that has their Wi-Fi on lockdown, you may not be able to access the online assessment tools. That's where a paper pencil might be essential. Just note that if you do a paper pencil assessment, it requires you to go manually enter that data into our system afterwards. And that's where we're really excited for the app. Once the app comes out, you'll be able to go into a school with Wi-Fi locked down. You'll be able to get the assessment filled out on the app. And then when that, when you get back to Wi-Fi access, it'll just push that information to the cloud for you and you don't need to re-enter anything. So we're really excited for that to be available to you by the end of the year. Okay.
One thing,
So
sorry, Brian.
Oh, please, please, Sharon.
I just had a couple of questions on this. If you are entering in that paper and pencil assessment, you'll just click on the assessments on the side and enter it in as though you are the student taking that assessment. So on the homepage, you'll select the assessment, enter the student's ID number, and then complete the assessment as though they were taking it on your device, just you referencing their answers on the paper pencil version.
I'm so glad you added that, Sharon. That makes all the sense in the world. Yeah, so Sharon just described, if you fill it out paper pencil, the way to submit those entries is to just go click on the service that they completed and fill it out on their behalf. Thank you. Great to point out. Okay, so I have walked through an option for filling it out with them taking it from your computer or from your screen. I've also noted how to fill it out with a group using a generate code option and how to generate a unique link for a specific student. If there's any comments or questions about this, please don't hesitate. The next thing I want to actually slow down and do is to show you how you can look at the data that results from each one of these services. Initially, I'm going to show you data that really represents aggregated data or combined data. But at the end, I'm going to show you what it looks like to see individual student responses. And really, we believe it's the combination of these data views that is going to be really powerful for you and your agencies. And just a reminder, all of this data is coming in real time, and so it's available immediately after the service. And so one thing I'll remind you of, we're looking at a demo site. So this data is all fabricated, and yet it can tell a story of how this will look for you, even without it being based on real data outcomes. So here what you're looking at is the bar charts across each one of the services that have been provided. So For JobX, we have job exploration, we have counseling on post-secondary enrollment, independent living, orientation, mobility, and so on. One thing I want to point out is that all of the assessments are rescored from 0 to 100 to make it really easy for you to get an idea of how students are doing and how to interpret the data. One thing I'll point out, we're really excited to see that none of the students are scoring at the lowest level on average. It's a very rare thing to see students bottoming out in their scores. It's also a very rare thing to see students hitting the ceiling of 100 in their scores. We hoped for that so that we could really show progress and change over time. Now, let me just break down how this data can be used. So I'm going to go to self-advocacy since that's the one I filled out earlier with our fake student. And you can see here that the yellow bar represents the average baseline or pre-assessment score for all of the students in your agency. One thing I want to highlight, when you log in, what you'll have access to is just the information for your agency. You won't be able to look around at other agencies, nor will other agencies be able to look around or look to the side at your agency. Now, Jennifer and others in state leadership, they would have access to look across all agencies or to look within individual agencies. However, you as agency providers will only have access to your own agency data because we really want to emphasize this is about you taking where you're at and making improvements from there. It's not about making improvements compared to any other group. So if I look at this data, I can see that the average pre-assessment score is 52.16 out of 100. And that's based on 34 students. That's what that N equals 34 stands for. So we know that there's been 34 demo or fabricated data points entered as a pre-assessment here in self-advocacy. And then that green bar indicates the average baseline, or excuse me, the average post-assessment score. So this is based on 13 students, and we're seeing an average out of 100 of 66.15. And that's where we'd like to see the yellow bar leading to an increase in the green bar, and that's what we're seeing, a higher green bar indicating that amount of change. This is also represented down below. So these blue bars just reflect the overall change happening for students. Now, these bars could go down. So if you happen to be working with a student or a group of students and their scores went down, you could see this bar going in the opposite direction, but that hasn't happened across states very consistently. And when it does, it often leads to corrections or improvements that reverse that trend. So in this case, we're seeing self-advocacy, as we just pictured it, is experiencing a change of about 25 points in the scale of 100 based on the 13 students who have done a post-assessment. Okay, so that allows you to get a little bit of a feel. And one thing I want to point out, this data coming in real time allows us to say, okay, I just want to look at my September numbers and get a sense of what's going on there. There hasn't been a ton of demoing in September, so you see those numbers go down. But I could also say, okay, I want to look at July through the end of August. And then that data really adjusts to show that. So if, as in some states, you're asked to report your data quarterly, that's easily done with just a few clicks. Now what I'd like to show you, now again, I'll just remind you, if I click on the data views on the left, I get a little bit more description of what each one of these are. The next one I'm going to show is just really the mirror of the bar chart. And this is the table version of that same data. The one nice thing about a table is that it offers some accessibility increase, and it allows for a little bit of sorting just by clicking on a box. So if I just want to see the different scores in order from highest to lowest amount of difference, I can click on that and see that job seeking comes in at the highest. And if I just hover over that, I'll see that counseling on post-secondary enrollment comes in at the second highest, and so on and so forth. Again, I could sort this by date if I wanted to. These are the first two aggregate views. They're most useful for an agency generally to say, how are we doing overall? They aren't giving a lot of guidance about individual students, but do you have any questions or comments about those data views? I am saving my favorite data view for the end. All right, the last one that I point to, or before I get to student data, is the quality of the work-based learning experience. This is that data that is based on the post-assessment only. So the first thing we ask about is the overall quality of the site that they did their work-based learning experience at. This is actually an 18-item scale that gets at several different components that we know affect job satisfaction. And so these are questions about whether they felt like they had connections at the workplace, people they could talk to, whether they felt like they had the ability to make choices in their workplace, and other questions focused on things like whether they felt competent in their workplace, like they had something to contribute. We know if they have those things, they'll tend to view it as an overall more quality experience. This is scored 0 to 100. You're seeing that in the demo, this is scoring at 61.55. The next question is a very simple one-item question that just asks the students at the end of their experience whether they'd recommend that same site to other students. And that's based on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being I would definitely recommend, 0 being no way I'd ever recommend students to go back there. And so this is scoring at an average of 6.89 based on, again, 19 people who have completed it. This is interesting. People have been using the demo. Yesterday, the average wage was $13.14. Some people, I'm assuming from Michigan, have given someone a really great hourly wage because the average now is sitting at 26.16 out of those who were paid. If you weren't paid, you aren't asked to enter wage information. And the completion rate, so we're seeing a completion rate of almost 95% in this fabricated data. That's just asking the students, did they complete the full experience as planned from initiation? If they said no, they're actually given a little bit of a place to say why they didn't complete it. And I want to highlight one thing about that. That qualitative data, that explanation, isn't available in any data views because it would be kind of clunky. However, you can get access to that data by going to the data export screen. One thing I really want to highlight here is if you are an agency that likes to do your own number crunching and analysis, you always have access to this data as your own by clicking on the download CSV option, and then you can merge it with your bigger data set. You could crunch numbers in different ways. Just it's yours to use however you'd like. One thing I'd like to point out though is if you have a data view that you really want to see and you need to go download it and create it yourself, you can always just recommend that we build that into our data views. We actually have mocked out several new data views that we're working on right now that we think are going to enhance the experience you have even more. Okay, now for my favorite data view. This is the student data. This is the data that I would have killed to have when I was a provider myself, doing voc rehab and working with students. This is before pre-ETS, I admit, but it was when I was doing many of these same services with young people. And so this allows me to go ahead and enter a specific case ID and gain access to that specific student. So you will remember I've been entering 81122 as my fake student or my fake case number. And you can see if I do that, I immediately can see which students I've provided or what I provided that student with as far as services and when I provided those services. Now that's less helpful for this number because I've just created it today and all of them have happened today. But we are seeing providers across states using this really extensively to do things like, I can't remember where I'm at with this student. I'm just going to enter their ID and remind myself of what services I provided and what services I'm working on, which services I need to finish up. So it's really nice just for organization of pre-ETS services. But more importantly, what I want to show you today is how you can use the data to start to customize services. Now, of course, you know I cooked the books, but I made it so this student had a really good experience with self-advocacy training. So their pre-assessment score is showing at 23.33 out of 100. Their post-assessment score is something that you would celebrate if you ever saw this. And we are seeing providers having this kind of success at times where it's jumped all the way to 76.67. Now that tells a pretty good story, but if I click on these assessments, it unfolds to show me each item that the student completed, and it gives me an opportunity to understand how they did across items. So each item is scored from 0 to 3. 3 means that they have the highest possible confidence in that area. 0 means they have the lowest possible confidence in that area. Now, I'm going to do this actually a little bit out of order, so forgive me if you were staring at that. I'm going to look at job seeking first, where we only have a pre-assessment. And I want to point out a few things. If I was a provider, what I would encourage you to do immediately after they take the job seeking assessment is to go look at the data and ask how it can help me inform me about how to handle these services. The first thing I'm going to notice, and that I recommend you to all notice, is if there's any strengths that the student is already coming to you with. So before I start services, I'm seeing the student is maxing out on an answer that they are able to answer questions in a job interview. If I see that from a student, I'm going to want to make sure I spend some time acknowledging that with the student. Hey, you seem to bring this skill set already to the services before even doing training. That'll be a huge help to you when you get to the actual place where you're doing job interviews. Then I would also look for areas that might need the most assistance. So I see zeros in a couple of areas. One is I know how to talk about my needs in a job interview. Maybe they're really struggling with that element, and I'm able to create a strong resume. Now, of course, I fabricated this, so it may not make a lot of sense overall, but when you look at this for real student situations, you'll say, these are spaces where I'm going to spend more time in the assessment, and I can spend a little bit less time in those areas they already have as strength. As you customize, we know from decades of research that you're going to have more effective outcomes for your students. Now, I'm going to pause there and ask if there's any questions before I show you what this could look like for a post-assessment. Okay. So if I'm doing this with a post-assessment, one thing I want to point out is I can pull up both of those assessments and see how they did in the pre and the improvement they made item by item in the post. Now, we already know we're happy about the improvements that have been made, but the student isn't scoring at 100 either, so we know there is room for improvement if we want to make that improvement right now. And that really comes down to your clinical judgment and the student's preferences. I would argue that if this is a freshman in high school and you've helped them jump from 23 to a 73, then you might call it a day. Or a 76, forgive me. You might say we're in a really good place and we'll keep working on this in future years to help them get all of these self-advocacy skills over time. However, if this is a senior in high school and they're about to exit high school to other things, you might say, oh, shoot, we're doing really well and we've made a lot of improvement, but that student is still scoring at a 1 on I speak up when I'm not being treated fairly. And you're concerned about that might mean for them, the implications that might have for post-high school life. You can always say, between the student and I, we decided we're going to continue doing services to see if we could get that area a little bit higher. And then you can do another post-assessment. One thing I really want to highlight with this statement is you can actually post-assess as many times as you feel necessary to help you and the student get to a place where you're both satisfied with. The change score is always going to be based on the most recent post-assessment compared to the initial baseline. And so you can keep post-assessing until you all feel good about where you got in your services. What's really powerful about that to me is that means that you're customizing at the beginning based on the student's profile, but you're also customizing at the end based on whether the services have been completed sufficiently. Now notice this allows for you to customize in the middle as well. So if you're starting a service and you don't feel confident that the group is coming with you, you could do a post-assessment halfway in and get an idea of which students are benefiting and which ones aren't, and you can make some adjustments based on that data. We argue this is one of the most powerful parts of the TRT. It's great to know for administrative purposes that the average is improving, but it's so powerful to tap into individual experiences and customize the services to the student's needs to get more effective outcomes one by one. Even in a group format, we believe that if you would focus on the individual, you can get better outcomes from the group by realizing that they don't all start in the same place and they're not all as in the same skill set. When you recognize that in the group, you can find little ways to customize the services even in a group format. Okay, so that walks us through the primary data views. I'm again just going to pause and see if there's any questions here. Okay. Now, yesterday we had a small group and it appeared that most people had computers available to them so they could do a little bit of practice on their own, walking through some of these. I mean, you're all watching this online. I don't know how many of you are doing it from a phone. Would it be useful to you? Let me just ask it this way instead of assuming. Would it be useful to you if you had 5 to 10 minutes to walk through this yourselves and get familiar with some of the assessment tools before we get into how to administer the assessments? Just give me a little feedback there and we'll respond accordingly. So the question I'd like to ask is just if you'd like a little bit of time to look at these yourselves. Okay, thank you, Nikita. Great. I would hope so. That's music to my ears. So for some of you, if you just have a phone, it's going to be a little bit harder to navigate for your first time. It is possible, but it's easier with more real estate. But I'm going to give you until, let's say, I'm got to make the time change here. Let's say 10:10. We'll come back together at 10:10 to talk about this. What I'd ask you to do is to use that demo login and just mess around. That's probably not a scientific enough word. You look at all the features in this app and get familiar with what's available to you, and then we'll come back together with any questions or concerns. One thing I would just note, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If it's not an urgent question, we'll save it until everyone is done with their own exploration. If it's a pretty urgent question, we'll fill in right then and there so that it can benefit all the people getting through the tour. All right, so I am going to let you explore on your own. Sharon and I will help problem solve if anyone has difficulty accessing it or if anyone has difficulty navigating the features. And we'll reconvene at 10:10 Eastern Time. Putting the demo login back up just in case some of you aren't in there yet. One thing I'll point out, and then I'm going to turn off my video so you can just explore, but you can use this demo agency. It's not going away. And so you can use this anytime you want to explore a feature or practice with the website in general. It's always available to you. So Chloe asks a great question. Is there a participant ID we can use to access surveys? You can make up any ID you would like, any case ID. Just make sure you use only numbers. Otherwise, it will throw an error at you. The other thing I would just say is it might be enjoyable for you to look at you creating a pre and a post assessment. If you do that, just make sure you enter the same number for both the pre-assessment and the post-assessment. That's how the system registers whether it's a pre or a post. The last thing I'll tell you is if you really want to look at a pre-assessment, make sure you use a unique number. So I'm telling you right now, if you use 1, 2, 3, 4, other people have used it in the demo, so it's going to automatically show up as a post-assessment. Just a few tips for you, but you can use any fake number for the case ID you want in this demo space. Again, once you have your own login information, you'll use that case ID that's given to you through StateVR, through Jennifer's team.
Yeah.
Playing with it.
Yeah, but I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory.
It's actually quite impressive.
Mhm.
I'm not sure about the language.
Okay, it's 10:10. And so we'll bring this back together and we'll answer a couple of the good questions that were put in the chat. We'll open up for any other questions that this may have caused. First of all, Jessica asked a great question, and that's whether you can see a graph of change for a single student or only the numerical data. Right now, you can only see the numerical data, but we have been working on a chart that we'll soon have in place that allow you to see students' data trends over time. And that would even allow over multiple years. So you can get a real sense for where the students started from and how they've progressed. And that's particularly nice for people who do multiple post-assessments. You'll be able to see each one of those post-assessment points over time. I hope that'll be in place shortly after or within very soon reach of when you all have access to the assessment tools. The other question that got posed is, why does it seem like I have additional data other than my student? I believe, and Nikita, clarify if I misunderstand this, but I believe what you're noting is when you go in and you entered student data, many other student numbers are showing up. That's simply because you're in the demo site and all of us are using the same demo site. So it's collecting all of that data at once together. However, once you have your own username and password and you're logged in with your own agency, what you'll see is your agency's data is all housed in there, and you'll be able to then sort within your agency. We aren't yet providing views for individual providers. We've actually been cautioned against that with most of the states we've been working with, because we've seen a lot of states where providers will have some turnover experience that might be difficult for us to kind of keep on top of. Or they might even have situations where if a provider's sick one day, they'll have another provider fill in and provide a service. So right now, we don't know that it's functional or practical for us to have views that are specific to individual providers within agencies. Instead, we're opting for you to go search for your students through their case IDs. We're always open to feedback there. We're always trying to make improvements. But right now, most of what you're going to see with data views are agency level data. But Nikita, answer me if I'm misunderstanding where you were coming from. But right now, what you're seeing is the data for everyone in the demo agency. So everyone fabricating data under the demo agency.
Yeah, that helps. Because at first, I went in and I got totally confused because I saw these numbers and I'm like, this is not my person.
Yeah.
But then I was able to put in the student number and get my person. So it'll just look different when it's agency specific.
Correct. And the real nice advantage of that, if I can just capture the flip side, is if you are working in an agency and someone is out sick, you in that agency could look up that student's ID number. And if you're filling in for them, or if there's turnover and you're filling in for someone while you're looking for a replacement for that person, having agency level data means that you can really still work as a team to provide the best services to the student based on the data. It's not siloed into providers and not being able to see across providers within the agency. However, like I said, you can't see across different agencies. Only state leadership can do that.
Got it.
Any other questions or concerns that came out of the tour? Again, we try to keep it pretty simple and straightforward. We hope that it can be intuitive to navigate in some ways, but we also know it's a pretty new idea, and that measuring pre-post change is a concept that we haven't done a lot in state VR. And so that's why, or on our contract providers, I assume. And so that's where I want to spend the next part of our training, really this last portion, on how you will administer the assessment tools in a way that gets accurate information for your students. Okay, so I am going to scroll forward. Now I'm going to scroll past a couple of things here, just catching us up to where we were, but I've just embedded in the slide deck a little bit of information on your job, creating a code and the student's instructions for using that code, your job in creating a general specific link for the student, and the student's job in doing that, just to give you that reference. But now, importantly, we need to talk about how you're going to administer the TRT effectively. One of the things we really want to emphasize with the TRT, we provided you a way to measure change or improvement over time. We are not, however, doing anything to interrupt your decision about what services you provide and administer. That's between you and your state leadership. We are not giving any guidance on when to conclude a service. That's again between you and your state leadership team. The one thing we want to emphasize here, we will teach principles about when to administer. And in large part, what we want to emphasize is the when is really connected to when you expect that change has occurred. But you also can do multiple repeated assessments to make sure you and the client are satisfied. And then importantly, you will determine how to administer the assessments. And we're going to talk about that how in a moment, because that's a really critical piece to all of this. All right, so importantly, in determining which assessments to measure, we just want to circle back to each one of these 10 tools and note something here. You will determine which services you're going to work on at any given time. We just want to make sure that whatever service you're doing matches with the correct or corresponding assessment tool. So if you're doing work-based learning, for example, or self-advocacy, we want to make sure you use the tool that goes with that element. Now, one thing I want to clarify in all of this, match the assessment to the service. You can do multiple services at the same time, which would require multiple assessments at the same time. So an example that I see people using sometimes in Utah is sometimes people want to combine job exploration services with self-advocacy services. Nothing wrong with that. We don't have any evidence one way or another in the research, so I'm all about them trying to do that. That would just mean when they do that baseline assessment, that pre-assessment, they would do both of those at the same time when they're initiating that service. Then they could decide whether or not they want to have both services last for the exact same amount of time. They may choose to have one service end and they would do the post-assessment for it, and then they'd continue with the other one for a little bit longer and then do the post-assessment for that one. You have all the freedom in the world to tailor your services how you want and to do multiple services at the same time. The only caution here is that you want to be careful not to attempt too many services at the same time or have too many assessments associated with those going on at the same time. We find students can get overwhelmed if they're asked to work on 9 different areas of transition all at once. And so there's a little bit of thoughtfulness that can go into that. Multiple post-assessments can be conducted with the same student. We've mentioned that multiple times. It can be useful. And then we want to slow down and talk about the specific case of work-based learning. Now, Jennifer chimed in last training very usefully and said a lot of this will come back to which services you're authorized to provide. And that's perfect. That's the best guide you can possibly have. One thing we want to clarify, we are not here to change anything about how you report your services. So no matter what you're currently doing to report services, that's what you should continue doing. That said, we want to make sure that with work-based learning experiences, you're using the right assessment tool. Some states, and actually the federal regulations, indicate that work-based learning includes paid work experiences, but it could also include things like informational interviews. The only challenge to that when you're trying to measure change is that our assessment for the work-based learning experience really assumes that people are getting a real work experience. And we'll talk about what we consider to be real work principles in just a minute. But that means if you're doing an informational interview, even if you typically do frame that as work-based learning for your reporting, the assessment that's going to match with that much more cleanly is the job exploration scale. Because the change that's happening from an informational interview, we would argue, is a change in your information or your understanding about work, where the change we're capturing in the work-based learning experience scale is about the change you get from experiencing real work. And so again, please don't change how we report for your case management data, but we want to make sure you're using the tool that aligns with the change. So a couple guidance points for this. We know that you'll use the work-based learning experience scale if you're doing a paid work experience, a paid internship, a practicum, or a pre-apprenticeship. That's pretty clearly work-based learning and real work. We would encourage you to use the job exploration scale if you're doing a career-related competition, an informational interview, workplace tours or field trips, simulated work experiences, or career mentorships. Then there's another segment that's more of a gray area that's going to require us to think a little bit harder. And these are areas like job shadowing, volunteering, non-paid work experiences, non-paid internships, service learning, and student-led enterprises. In that case, we offer a few guiding principles here. We would argue it's more like real work if it has the following characteristics. So if that gray area element has a minimum of 10 hours in the same job, agency, organization, or work setting, you're likely leaning into a real work experience. If it's supervised by a member of the entity where the work is occurring, then it's more likely to be a real work experience. If there's no supervision, it's not mapping onto what a real work experience would usually look like. The third one, if the student is doing work that contributes to the mission or the purpose of the entity where the work is taking place. This is just to emphasize that if it's real work, it's not doing fake jobs for that workplace. It's doing jobs that contribute. And last of all, typically if it's real work, it's going to be happening in an integrated environment. But these are not rules that we ask you to rigidly follow. They're just meant to be some guidance to help you get through that gray area to say, what am I changing through this experience? Am I changing their feelings about work through their real work experience? Or am I maybe changing more informational understanding as we would through a job exploration experience? And that would indicate which scale to use. Any comments or questions about that one area that's a little bit more murky than any of the others? Okay. All right. So we want to provide a little bit of instruction about the timing for pre-post administration. First of all, with pre-assessments, we would always encourage you to do this prior to the beginning of services. That's because with these students, many of whom haven't experienced a lot of transition services, will actually start to show change pretty quickly after you initiate services. The problem then of administering a pre-assessment or a baseline assessment after you've already started administering services is you're going to miss some of the change that you created in not measuring right at the beginning before they started the service. So always do a baseline assessment before you initiate services. However, we encourage you whenever possible not to do it more than 72 hours before you begin that specific service. The reason why is time creates noise. The more time you have between when you do the baseline and when they actually start service, the more possibility you give that some other factor is going to affect their change that you didn't account for. So this could be any number of things. Maybe you do a baseline assessment with the student and then 2 months later you start services. However, in that 2-month period, maybe that student experienced their parents going through a divorce. I probably should use a less sad example, but I'm just saying that in that case, their baseline score probably isn't going to reflect where they're at any longer. They're going through a lot and they're experiencing a lot, and now time has allowed for the possibility that other things are affecting their change. Now, of course, time is always going to affect change and other factors are going to affect change, but if you limit this to be really close to when they start services, then you're going to have less likelihood that other factors are influencing their change scores. All right. Now, for the post-assessment, you want to do this after completion of services, and you can do it whenever you want to check in on progress, as we already mentioned, but you'll never want to wait more than 72 hours after the service ends for the same reasons I just described for the pre-assessment. In this case, though, it's really important that you, whenever possible, give them the post-assessment at that last service you provided while you still have them with you. We found across other states, if you let them leave that last service and then you tried, for example, to send them a link to say how much they benefited from that service, they're more likely to blow it off. I once had an agency reach out to me saying they were batting about 50% with their students completing it if they let them walk away from the service. So we really recommend with the post-assessment, just have them do that post-assessment before they leave you in that last time you meet with them for that service. And of course, post-assessment can happen anytime you expect meaningful change has occurred. That's really one of the main principles guiding when a post-assessment could be given. Comments or questions on timing? We know in the real world, this won't always work out. You may have to do one a little bit longer or a little bit earlier than we intended, than is ideal, but this is what you want to strive for to make sure your data comes out as accurate and effective as possible. Okay, one of the last main points I want to focus on with you all is your options for administration and how you would determine whether students should self-report. So I've already spent some time on this one, so I won't do much more here. But you or your student enter the data directly into the TRT software. That's the preferred option because it's the most efficient. The second option, though, is to use a paper pencil version. You really will have to do a paper pencil version if you don't have Wi-Fi right now in the space you're doing the assessment, or if you're using another language that's going to be provided for you for the student's sake. Again, as I mentioned, before the end of the year, we're just testing it right now. There'll be a TRT app that you can use without Wi-Fi that allows that data to be pushed to the cloud after you regain access to the internet. Now, I forgot, but this is such an important point. Really important. One of your main roles in administering all of these assessments is to create buy-in. If you have students who don't understand the reason why they're filling this out, then one of two things might happen. One, they might be really apathetic about it and blow it off or just fill it out without much thought. Two, they might overthink it and feel anxious, believing that they're the ones being evaluated and they've got to get a good score. Either one is going to make your data less effective and less accurate. So we want them to understand that this is being done, importantly, to help offer the right services at the right time, to improve the services they receive, and to make sure they have effective transition outcomes. And to reduce that anxiety, we want to make sure they understand this is not a test and there's no right or wrong answers. But it really is on you as the providers to make sure they understand and they buy it. Otherwise, they're not going to spend the time to give you accurate data. Okay, so when you're supporting them in the accuracy of the data, a couple of thoughts here. You'll want to make sure you provide them the instructions on the purpose. You'll also want to provide them a little bit of a space for some privacy. If they feel like you're kind of hovering over their shoulder in completing the assessment, it might influence their scores, might make them want to score a little bit differently with that oversight. The other thing I want to point out here, if a student isn't able to fill it out on their own and you need to help them with it, or an observer needs to fill it out, just be thoughtful about who should help them. If you just gave them the service and now you're helping them to fill out the assessment tool, they again may not feel like they can fill it out accurately. It may be better for a teacher's aide, another counselor, a trusted parent or guardian to help them fill it out so they can feel like they can do it more accurately. If that's not available, we want to be realistic. It's better to get assessment data from you helping them fill it out than not getting it at all. Okay, now this is the part where I wanted to slow down a little bit because this is important information about administering the assessment tools. In our experience across other states, most youth have the ability to self-report at this fourth grade reading level. However, this is not always the case, and depending on your caseload, it may not be the case in the majority of the students you work with. We acknowledge that, and we want to lean into that. There's three primary components that should guide your decision about whether to let participants self-report. The first overarching principle I want to share is if students can accurately self-report, they should. That should be our default. We want the student's voice to be the leading voice in the TRT when possible. However, sometimes it's not, and that's usually because of these three possible areas: reading level or reading ability, reading comprehension, and then self-awareness and an accurate knowledge of the service that you're about to provide. So let me walk through each one of these and how you can handle them. And if you have any questions, this is an important place for you to chime in. First of all, concerns about reading level or reading ability. And I'm going to talk about this in a one-on-one situation or in a group format because they're going to be a little bit different here. If you sense that reading level is potential concern and you're in a one-on-one situation, you could ask the person to read aloud the first item or two to determine whether self-report is appropriate. Now, if you're in a group format, the last thing we'd want you to do is point out specific students and ask them to read aloud to see if they can. That would likely result in a really negative experience for the student. In a group format, what we recommend is if you're doing this in groups, just default to reading each of the items aloud to the students to make sure that you've covered your bases in case there's any students who aren't able to read at a fourth grade reading level. Now, you might be able to avoid this situation if you have a teacher or a teacher's aide in the room who knows the students really well and can confirm to you that all the students are fine to navigate the assessments on their own. If you don't have that confirmation, we just recommend the default being that you read it aloud to the group. When reading level is the only concern, it's obvious that we would want them to still self-report because the accommodation of reading aloud is just so easy to make for the students. There might be a unique situation where that's not the case, but in most cases, you're just going to read aloud to make this accommodation so they can still self-report. Now, the harder case is when they can read, but they have a low reading comprehension. And this is a little bit harder to navigate. If you're one-on-one, you can do this by recommending the person to talk through the first item or two to give you their rationale for why they chose the option they did. This is very difficult in a group format, and instead we'd ask you to rely on teacher or teacher aide perceptions about whether any students could read, but might have difficulty with comprehension. If they have difficulty with comprehension, you would have the option to complete it on their behalf through an observer, or to help them fill it out with a little bit of support. If you're in a group format, you'll want to be thoughtful about this. It might mean having some extra teacher's aides in the room to help those students who need help with comprehension to do it in a different space. Again, we want to avoid any students feeling like they're being too put on the spot or having a negative experience. It could be that you have those students do it at another time, maybe the day before or the day after. You could choose how you want to handle this, but be thoughtful. We don't want to affect any students negatively. One thing I'd point out in this decision of whether to fill it out on their behalf or not, it really comes back to practical issues of time. Once I had a provider reach out to me and say, I just took a half an hour to help a student who had comprehension concerns getting through an assessment, and now my day's schedule is totally ruined. I told that provider without any hesitation that we would never intend for them to ruin their whole day's schedule just to do a TRT assessment. And so, practically speaking, if it's going to take you more than 5 to 10 minutes to help a student fill out the assessment and you don't have that kind of time, we would just have you default to having an observer fill it out on their behalf. If, on the other hand, they just need a few clarifications and it's going to take an extra 30 seconds, well, that's a clear area where you would help them with a little bit of assistance so they can still have their voice be heard. It'll really hinge on the practicality of that situation and what'll create the best data without ruining your day's schedule. The last option, and perhaps one of the most important to address with this age group, is self-awareness and, relatedly, the accuracy of their knowledge of a service. So here, if you sense that a participant will provide self-ratings that are extremely too high or way too low, we recommend talking the participant through the first item or two to determine whether self-report is appropriate if you're one-on-one. But if you're in a group setting, again, hopefully you can get that kind of insight from a teacher or from an aide, or if you've been in that classroom a lot, from your own observation and experience. When self-awareness is a concern, however, completing on their behalf is the preferred approach. When you try to sit down and assist a student who has self-awareness differences or deficiencies, you're inviting a conflict in that assessment. You're inviting a conflict with the student about what they think of themselves. We don't think that's a good use of the TRT. So if self-awareness is a concern, we would just ask you to have an observer fill it out on their behalf. Now, if they have accuracy issues with the service, maybe they think that financial literacy is really only the ability to talk your mom into letting you buy a treat when you go to the store. One thing you can do before doing a baseline assessment is just helping them understand a few of the things that will be done as part of that service. So the student has some accurate knowledge of whether they are good in those areas or whether they need assistance in those areas. Spending a little bit of time with the student to help them get an overview of what that service is about before they do the baseline can actually help with a lot of the issues around accuracy of understanding of what the service is. So that walks us through these 3 critical areas in determining whether students should self-report. It actually captures one of the most important areas where we get frustration from providers. It's frequent that I'll get well, not that frequent, but once every few months, we'll get a call from a provider, a new provider usually, who says, I just let an assisted student fill out the assessment tool. Their data is not at all accurate, and therefore I can't trust the TRT. And we just want to always gently press on the provider. It's actually you who gets to dictate whether they fill that out in a self-report format. And it's you who can control the accuracy of that data, because if they aren't in a place where they would provide accurate data, that's where you have the opportunity to either assist them or to fill it out on their behalf. And that's exactly what we'd encourage you to do as you work with the students. One thing I'd like to point out, though, you don't have to be right or perfect, I should say, in your determination. Sometimes you might have a student that you think should self-report, and then you get the data and you really don't think it accurately reflects where they're at. If that happens once in a while, you do have two options. You could always reach out to Sharon, and she could reset that assessment for you, and you could have it completed again. However, you could also can take some confidence that one data point from one student that's not accurate isn't going to change the narrative from the trend in your data. One of the things we really value about the TRT is if you work with a lot of students, the data is going to tell the truth overall. One student case may not be accurate, so you would never want to make huge changes based on one student response. But if you're looking at your data as a whole, you can really start to make determinations with confidence that you know what's going on and what's working best in your services. I'm going to pause again, and I'm going to check the Slido to see if there's any questions or concerns that you have around this area of administration. Okay. All right, then we just have a few.
Hey, Brian, we did actually have someone leave a message in Slido. I have put it in the chat here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Let me pull up the chat. Sometimes I'm sharing screen. Oh, thank you, Sharon. These assessments seem to not be based in fact, but more on students' perception, which isn't always the best indicator. Oh, I love it. Let's go here for a minute. Fact is a really interesting word in transition. We actually struggled with this for a good year and a half in Utah, where we were deciding whether or not we could pull something like this off. A couple of things I'd like to say in answer to this question then, and I want to give it full weight because it's a great question. There aren't a lot of set facts in transition. Medical doctors have the advantage. I just had a nephew break a bone the other day at a birthday party, and the facts they use to fix that bone are very much objective facts that exist outside of any person. But in transition, even the most tangible objects like a resume have very little agreement about what makes one effective or ineffective. Or observing a job interview. I've actually done some research in this area. Employers disagree strongly in what is the facts about a good interview process or a bad interview process. And so we are going to have to rely to some extent on perception. The one thing that's really positive about this is that in perception, we do know from the research that there is some reality. If we perceive ourselves as being confident or good at something, we're more likely to succeed in accomplishing it. Now, it's not the same thing as a fact. And one thing we really decided early on in Utah is we can't let great be the enemy of good in measurement here. I think one of the things that stopped VR from ever moving to measuring change is this very issue where we don't have perfect facts that we can hang our hats on. Even things like employment aren't perfect facts because there's many other variables besides our work with the client that influence whether they get a job. I know that because I've worked with clients in a unemployment rate of 2%, and I've worked with clients in an unemployment rate of 8%. And you can guess which one made me look like a better counselor. But the bottom line, and I don't want to minimize this comment because we wrestled with it. Our hope is that if you'll lean into this and listen to the student voice, what we're finding from other states is that it is proving useful still, even though it isn't as fact-based as maybe the medical profession, or certainly as construction or other physics areas. We don't have that kind of liberty with transition. But what we do have in these student perceptions about these critical elements of services are guides that we know do predict better outcomes down the road. Now, that was a Slido anonymous question, and I totally support that. I'd also, though, say if you have any follow-up questions here, that was a great question. So I'd be happy to entertain any follow-up concerns related to that. Forgive me if I geek out a little bit too long on that, but that's a really great question that we wrestled with for a really long time. And again, the only thing I can really share to answer that question or assuage those fears is, as we've been using this in other states, they are finding this data to be meaningful and useful, and that it is helping them to get to a better place with their students. One thing I want to emphasize, sometimes instead of change data, we rely on satisfaction data. And since I have a few minutes, I'll share an example of when I worked with a colleague to try to create my own pre-ETS curriculum, and we administered it to a bunch of students in Pennsylvania. We got done with that service, and we asked students if they were satisfied, and unanimously the students said they loved the training. In fact, we had some written comments saying it was the best training they'd ever received, and we walked away pretty proud of ourselves and pretty happy about it. However, we also included pre-post change measures, and the honest truth was that in some of the areas with our service, now it was a very short service, and we think that was a big part of the problem, but we didn't see significant change from students who said they were extremely satisfied. It was just a reminder that satisfaction is actually a much poorer indicator of success than any measure of change. And what we're seeing from these measures of change has been actually quite positive. Any comments or reaction there? Okay, great question. Okay, now one thing we really think is important here, starting to use new data elements always has some element of risk to it. How is that data going to be used? One thing we strongly encourage, and we're so excited to work in Michigan because Jennifer really lives and breathes this ethos, is reframing risk as opportunity. We don't have any research telling pre-ETS providers the best way to do your services. That means, in my opinion, that you are going to be the ones that help us determine what are the best ways to do these services. But you might encounter situations where outcomes might be unexpectedly challenging or unfavorable for you. Instead of framing that as a judgment against you or your services, we would ask you to lean into it and frame it as an opportunity for growth and for improvement. Really, that's what this is entirely about. And I'm going to let Jennifer chime in here because we've talked about this, but this is not a tool that's going to be used as a form of criticism or penalty. It's really about that ladder of change and development.
Yep, absolutely, Brian. That's, we're just trying to gather that data and, making sure that our students are successful in the services that we're providing. So, and I know you touched on it too, you all are using curriculums, when you're providing the services. This is also, a tool, to assist you in saying, is there something that I can improve on when providing a service? So, this is all meant to be positive. Nothing, negative should be coming out of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. That's perfect. So as we wrap up, the one thing I want to convey is this may feel, or maybe you hope this was like the one time you're going to be with us and we're going to provide this training, but we view this as the beginning of our support for you. We're here for you in many different ways. Sharon already mentioned she's full-time, and her full-time effort is to provide your success. We also offer weekly refresher training, so you can always just go and sign up for through the slide, the link here available in the slide, and these will be sent out to you. These are just half-hour sessions you can jump on at any time. And then we offer on-demand video trainings, and I want to actually just segue over to those real quick and show you what this looks like, because I didn't spend much time here. So with our last few minutes, let me just show you all of the resources you have available to you to help you as you initiate the TRT. One of the things that you have available to you is a help center. Sharon is building this out constantly. So she gets questions that come in, she's adding those questions and the answers to those questions to this library. So we have account management questions, assessment administration questions and answers, and then thoughts on the data views. We have user guides, including whether to self-report, and then FAQs, just frequently asked questions and their answers. One thing you'll also notice, we just keep an ongoing list of all the updates and improvements we're making to the site week to week. We're always trying to make improvements, and we're always open to you giving us suggestions for where those improvements might occur. Now, if I go down one more, you would not be required to watch these training videos. Your colleagues who don't do any of the onboarding sessions will be required to go watch this a little bit over an hour set of on-demand training videos. Now, this looks like a very lengthy set of viewings, but what we've done is just broken them down into very minute detail. So if you just want to go watch one specific segment, you can skip right to that segment and learn more about it. So if you want to go remind yourself how to handle self-awareness concerns, clicking on this link will take you right to that part of the video so you can get those answers. And then if you wanted to schedule a training or just to meet for some questions or concerns, you can always do that by clicking on the link below. Also, I would just note that for new people who are training or who, when there's turnover, who might be starting to use this for the first time, they would go and access these training videos, and then we'd actually require them to meet with us for just a brief period of time so we can certify that they understood how to use the TRT. We take that seriously because the data is only as good as your administration. So we want to make sure everyone understands how that works. Rochelle asks, can I also have the recording sent to me to go back and follow the steps? I see a nodding head from Jennifer. That's a yes.
Yes, yep. I am actually, after we do all of our onboarding sessions this week, I will be sending out an email to you all who, have registered, and then there will be the recording and then just some, like a little bit of reminders. So, yep, you will most definitely get the recording.
Perfect. And then last of all, you can always just click on the Contact Us page. Shran is incredible at what she does. I am so grateful for what she means to our company, but one thing it means for you is just really quick responsiveness, very professional help, and getting an answer for you. And so we have a coding team that's constantly working on updates, and she works closely with them to make sure we get things figured out and get you on your way with things worked out. Okay, so let me just jump back for a moment here. See if I can get back into presentation mode, and we'll wrap things up a little bit. So I did provide a comment from one of the operation managers from the largest PREETs in Utah. And I won't read it, but as you get the slide deck, you'll just note that our providers, our contract providers, have been the most excited about the TRT. We thought that it would be our state leads, but in every state we've been in, once they've started using it, it's been our contracted providers who have gotten the most benefits from the TRT. And we've been really, really happy about that. All right. So let me just conclude, and then I'll let Jennifer have any last words here with our meeting today, and we'll open it up for any final questions that you may have. But I just want to acknowledge this is a big step in a new direction. And we are here with you, and we're really committed. If this toolkit isn't quite working how you'd like it to, or how you need, we're committed to doing our best over the course of this year to make it work even better. However, we've been saying that to every state since we started doing this 3 years ago, and we've worked out a lot of the kinks, and we've made this work in ways that the states we're in have really enjoyed. So we just want to keep being responsive and keep offering this opportunity. The one thing I'll say is this is personal for me. Not only was I a VR counselor, but I have 2 brothers who have Down syndrome. And for me, this is personal because I do believe it's a wonderful thing for you as providers to have information about student change. It's also a really wonderful, timely thing for students to be able to have confidence in these services because we're measuring that change. It's a powerful thing to have more indicators of just how much good you do as well. It's powerful for me to look across states and see these change scores going up significantly across all these areas. And it just gives you a lot more confidence in all the ways you're impacting students in a very holistic and meaningful way. So we're grateful for the time you took today, and I'll turn it back over to Jennifer. And then if there's any final questions or concerns, we still have at least 10 minutes of time here.
I'll just pause real quick for if there's any questions, Brian.
Oh, great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have an MRS question. As far as the agencies go, will we need to report this to a counselor, send them the results? How will this work? Or can, our counselors review the information online? And, you know, how do we work with MRS in this?
Yeah, so very good question. So what I would say is, having that communication with your counselor, your referring counselor is always good. Especially when you are providing a service to that student. So they are not going to be able to have that full access that like myself and Jessica are going to have. Because we will be, pulling information and, because this is a pilot and we want to show the benefit of the program and what we're doing. So with that, we will have the statewide like information gathered. But for you, Nikita, I would just, recommend you to have that conversation with your counselor and, and provide that information, because you also can utilize this as your report when you're done providing that service to the student for billing that authorization. Or maybe you can use it as that touch point, like, I don't think the student is fully grasping, let's just say, self-advocacy. So I think we need, to do some additional work with the student, because this is what they're struggling with, because on the post-test, they're still scoring, a 1 or 2, so you can have that as that conversation setting.
Okay, and then also a fee question. Are there additional fees that will be given to administer this test, or will it just go in with the service fee, like job expiration, work readiness, work-based learning?
Yep, it's going to go straight into that authorization fee. So there's not going to be an additional fee or anything to provide this to set it up. You can talk to your managers and, have that conversation with them. And you can, loop me into also too with that conversation if there is concern about, setting up the toolkit for each, referral that you get in. We can definitely have further discussion on that.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, administering it, you say it's 2 to 5 minutes. However, I know it's going to take longer than that. I mean, the first day, as as Brian said, we're going to let them know the reasoning for the assessment. Everybody gets real jittery when it's time for an assessment, as well as, maybe answer questions throughout and afterwards. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't say this would take 3 to 5 minutes.
So in the beginning, yeah, it probably will take a little bit longer, to get going, just because it's a new tool. It's something, to utilize and, make sure that you are aware of how it's working and, all those pieces. So that's completely understandable. So with that, one of the things that we also can say is, we know students get scared of when they hear the word assessment, or they hear the word test, or they hear, like, oh my gosh, now I got to use my brain kind of, and think. So this is something too, that when you are prepping the students to be like, hey, this is not, your normal test. It's not your normal assessment. We just want to see where you are at, what you understand. And there's no wrong or right answers. You're not being graded. So you can kind of help, a little bit with that. And one of the pieces that I've been, using as, instead of using like post-test or assessments, is a measure. We're just measuring where you're at. And sometimes using those words can help a little bit decrease the student's anxiety when they hear that word test or assessment.
That's a great response.
But yeah, we definitely can have further conversation, Nikita. What district are you from?
Detroit.
Okay. Yep, we can definitely have more conversation with your managers.
Yeah, because we get limited time, and we get, variably different times. So this is just something else we need to add, which I do think it would be very helpful, very necessary. I really love it. But all of our people that administer it will need to be trained on it, as well as, we're going to need extra time to administer it. And that's time over and above our regular curriculum.
Yep. And you also too,
Okay.
Nikita, one of my closing remarks too that I was going to say, and you brought it up, Nikita, is any staff that you have, so it could be an MRS counselor, it could be one of our partners staffing. So any staff that you have that is delivering a pre-ET service, they have to go through the onboarding process, because that's how you are going to get your login information to be able then to put that information in for the student. So when you receive an authorization, that's where you use that authorization to set up on the Transition Readiness Toolkit website platform. And then, so then you have that there. So if you have any other staff members that have not, done the onboarding, we have one more session, which is tomorrow. And then we can, so that will start that process where they can get their own login too.
Okay, so everyone in the agency will have their own login that's facilitating the tests.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. That's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great questions.
We got a couple more minutes. Do we have any other questions? All right, well, perfect. So thank you all for joining today. Hopefully you are as excited as we are to start utilizing this toolkit. As a reminder, you will be getting a follow-up email with a recording, and I am going to have a copy of the PowerPoint that Brian shared today. So you will also to be able to have that. And then any questions or anything that comes up, please feel free. You can email me, or also too, you have one more session you can register for tomorrow if there's something that you feel like you missed or you still need a little bit of clarity on. Please join. It's no problem. I know sometimes I have to see things a couple times to get it really sinking in my head sometimes, depending what it is.